Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who has definitely forgotten what private property is. The day everything changed began like any other weekend on my quiet lake parcel. As usual, I woke up early to drink coffee in my motorhome's small but cozy kitchen. Standing by the window, I watched the sunrise streak orange and pink across the still water. In those moments, I was grateful to live in my motorhome until I built a house. I bought this lot to be close to nature and our community's few houses. I never imagined one of my neighbors would ruin my morning peace so spectacularly, unbeknownst to me, by having a vendetta against my mobile home. I had lived here for over a year and met most of the locals. My motorhome was parked on a tidy plot of land that sloped gently to the lake. Almost everyone in the neighborhood knew my white and silver travel trailer. I didn't realize that familiarity was turning one neighbor off. Call this neighbor Conrad. I remember our first meeting. He seemed polite. He was tall and middle-aged, with neatly combed graying hair and always wore collared shirts. He insisted on pointing out his home like I'd never seen it before, explaining how the huge murals on its exterior walls were a tradition in his family. He also boasted about how his house had been featured in a local beautiful home showcase. I just nodded politely and assumed he was excited about local community pride. I should have noticed his subtle arrogance that dismissed anything he considered inferior in his voice. Perhaps my motorhome. Let me rewind and explain. This property was bought to build a house from scratch. Living in a motorhome on my land made more financial sense than renting an apartment or staying in a more expensive city while saving up. I consult for small businesses across the state 2 days a week from home and 3 days on the road. A comfortable setup. Since this neighborhood was friendly and safe, I rarely worried about my safety or property. People looked out for each other, I thought. So I started leaving my motorhome keys in the ignition or inside the motorhome, usually behind a cabinet panel. For years, I thought nobody would try to remove it. Since this was my land, the people seemed trustworthy. When I hosted a small lakeside cookout on a weekend, Conrad first appeared to be uncomfortable. I invited some old college friends and some new local acquaintances. We spent the day kayaking and fishing with low music and a barbecue grill. Conrad arrived uninvited in the mid-afternoon and introduced himself to my guests. I thought he was being neighborly, but then he kept saying, "You should really consider building soon," or "A house would look nicer on this property." He also said his house was one of the anchors of the community. I remember the awkward tension. Though my friends laughed off his unsolicited advice, I sensed hostility. After that day, Conrad left me alone for a few weeks, and I dismissed him as a quirky neighbor with too much civic pride. I was preoccupied with finishing my house plans. My architect and construction company were well regarded in the area. I wanted to start building in a few months once I had enough savings to avoid mid-project problems. Indeed, the motorhome was only a temporary stop. However, Conrad couldn't tolerate even a temporary eyesore. Another sign of trouble arrived in my mailbox, a polite but pointed letter. It read, "We kindly request that you relocate the mobile home to a more discreet area until a suitable permanent structure is built," on standard printer paper. No municipal authority issued it. It would be better served by a house that meets our community's aesthetic standards. Conrad's first name was written at the bottom in swirling cursive. No phone number or address, but I recognized the writing style from holiday postcards he showed me. I still gave him the benefit of the doubt and concluded he cared about the neighborhood's appearance. I ignored the strange letter. A third sign appeared one weekend morning. A strange shape spray-painted on a large plywood board propped against my motorhome. It looked like a mocking doodle of a house, castle, or pillared structure. I suspected Conrad because someone had written, "This is what belongs here," in red paint beside it. At that point, I felt uneasy, but not threatened enough to call the police. I trashed the plywood. The real turning point came a month after that ominous plywood. I returned from a 3-day business trip on Tuesday. I usually travel Wednesday to Friday, but that week's schedule changed, so I was away Sunday to Tuesday. When I arrived in my old pickup truck, I noticed the motorhome was not in its usual spot. I initially thought I was tired and missing something obvious, but the tire marks were gone, leaving flattened grass and dirt, too neatly empty to be an accident. My heart raced. It might have been towed, but I hadn't arranged that. I had no property complaints or late bills. Theft was my next suspicion, which was terrifying. Who wants my entire motorhome? I paced around the property, anxious to see if it had moved to another corner or behind some shrubs. That made no sense, but stress can cause illogical behavior. I realized it was gone after a few minutes. I returned to my pickup, grabbed my phone, and called the police. The dispatcher asked me to confirm my address and emergency calmly. While talking to them, I realized I have security cameras. I installed small, motion-activated ones when I moved in. I used them for wildlife monitoring and peace of mind on business trips. Local cloud storage holds footage. Checking those recordings was necessary. The dispatcher agreed to send an officer to my property after I told them I had footage. Then, shaking with rage and shock, I opened my phone's camera app. My heart raced. My motorhome must have been filmed if stolen. After checking the timestamps, I found a late Monday night clip. Single figure walked into frame. Night vision made the images grainy, but I could see the figure was tall, wearing a baseball cap, and confidently walking up to the motorhome door. The person climbed in after bending down and fiddling with the small lock I sometimes forgot to check. I almost dropped my phone when I saw the intruder's face in security footage. Conrad was identifiable by the profile captured by the camera. I never expected a respectable-looking neighbor to go this far, but he was bold as day. I watched the motorhome lights turn on and off in fascination and horror. Then the vehicle lurched forward, turning wide across my property and out of camera range. My chest tightened. He had stolen my home, my sleeping, cooking, and personal space, my refuge. 2 police officers arrived at my property within 30 minutes. They introduced themselves as Officer Teresa and Officer Mark. I explained the situation, showed them the footage, and estimated the motorhome and its contents value. Though stunned, they remained professional. They asked me why this neighbor would do that. Thus, I explained the tension caused by the letter, spray-painted plywood, and cookout. I showed them the letter I still had they requested. After photographing everything and writing a report, they told me they would handle it. They also suggested calling Conrad to see if he responded immediately, but they insisted that I let them talk to him. While filing the police report, a car drove past my property and slowed down as if to stare at us. The vehicle drove down the street as both officers glanced over. It was too dark to identify the driver, but I suspected Conrad or a close friend. My guess, he saw the patrol car's flashing lights and wanted to investigate. The next morning, the authorities hadn't told me where the motorhome was. I did my own detective work because I was restless. I drove my pickup truck around the neighborhood hoping to find my motorhome on a corner or lot. I ran on adrenaline and half a coffee. After an hour of fruitless searching, I returned and found something in a small side driveway near a friend's house. Tall bushes partially obscured an RV's shape through a row of hedges. I suspected it was mine. I got out of my truck and carefully walked up to confirm. I recognized the side panel scuff from a tree branch I had hit months earlier. It was my motorhome. A for lease sign was on a vacant lot behind it. No one was there. My mind raced. Could Conrad have stored it here to drive it later? His inaction made no sense. The property owners were absent, so Conrad may have thought no one would notice. I was dumbfounded as I viewed my motorhome from a bush. The whole situation was surreal. I was surprised a neighbor would remove a eyesore. Before trying to retrieve it, I called the police again to report finding my car. They told me to stay put, and an officer would meet me. I snapped lots of photos while waiting. Photos of the parking, surroundings, footprints, and tire tracks. I took some interior photos when I had the courage to peek inside. It was looted. Conrad must have searched my belongings or rummaged around to start it. Even though I usually left my keys in the ignition or nearby, I sometimes hid them under the floor mat in a locked compartment. He must have found them. A box of personal documents and my laptop bag were scattered. It was terrifying to think he was going through my stuff. Officer Mark arrived 30 minutes later alone. After inspecting the motorhome's interior and hearing my story, he said it was evidence of a crime. He advised me not to drive it away so a crime scene investigator could quickly sweep for prints, even though we had clear camera footage of Conrad's face. I agreed, but I felt uneasy leaving it. It was found technically. Officer Mark said they would move quickly because the theft was obvious and the suspect was filmed. He said he would personally talk to Conrad to see if he would confess or explain. I returned to my property to regroup and check for anything missing after that stressful morning. My mind was full of anger and violation. I saw a young woman in her late 20s wearing a sweater and jeans near my lakefront property while processing my emotions. As I approached, she introduced herself as Caitlin, a neighbor I'd seen but never met. She seemed nervous and apologized for intruding, but she requested a private conversation. I invited her to sit on one of my outdoor chairs, and she told me something that changed my view of Conrad. Caitlin claimed she was Conrad's niece, She moved in with him a few months earlier to find work. She said she had overheard Conrad on the phone boasting about "clear the neighborhood of that monstrosity," referring to my motorhome. She said she was afraid to confront him. She knew his obsessions could make him domineering. She assured me she would testify regarding what she heard if the police asked. Conrad had complained about property values and how my motorhome disgraced their neighborhood, she said. He was obsessed with the idea that the lake's land was destined for aristocratic homes. I snorted. It seemed absurd that a house near this small lake had to meet some absurd notion of aristocracy. Thank you, Caitlin, for being honest. She left after exchanging numbers. I sensed she was worried about family backlash for betraying her uncle, but she seemed determined to do the right thing. Her bravery reassured me that I wasn't overreacting or imagining a bigger conspiracy. Not in my head. The man had a vendetta. Officer Mark called that evening to say Conrad denied everything. He denied knowing about my motorhome's disappearance. Conrad dismissed the security camera footage as tampered or deepfake when the officer mentioned it. The officer called it one of the worst excuses on record. They would gather more evidence and issue an arrest warrant if necessary. I exhaled deeply. Though anxious, I was glad the police were taking it seriously. Conrad doubling down on his denial suggested complications. My future house was being built while this main drama unfolded. I was signing the contract with a reputable builder. The following weekend, Darren, the supervisor, would discuss blueprint changes with me. I wanted a small porch and larger kitchen. When I called Darren to confirm our appointment, he said a Lake Preservation Committee representative had contacted him and demanded that my new house plans follow certain aesthetic guidelines. I was suspicious when Darren said it was unusual because the county or city's zoning department would set guidelines, not an unofficial committee. Could Conrad be calling to sabotage my house building plans? Not knowing of any legitimate group by that name, I told Darren I'd look into it. We found no local lake preservation committee after a quick online search. It appeared to be a sham or a loose group of neighbors without legal standing. I suspected Conrad was behind the coincidence, which was too big to ignore. The man tried to remove my motorhome and prevent me from building a new home on my land. No doubt, he wanted me gone. After the on-site investigation, the police let me get my motorhome the next day. The cabin contained Conrad's partial fingerprints and personal items like a local bank monogrammed pen. That seemed sufficient evidence to proceed. I was glad to bring my motorhome home. Ironic. But I felt sad looking at it. The safe haven changed. Being told someone had broken in and driven it away violated everything I valued. I promised more security. To prevent a repeat, I added higher resolution cameras, changed the locks, and added a hidden GPS tracker to the motorhome. A week after the incident, Conrad was arrested, which was both scary and reassuring. According to my understanding, the police collected camera footage, witness statements. Caitlin recounted Conrad's phone rant and fingerprints. He was charged with grand theft of my motorhome. Local chatter said he was jailed for 2 nights before posting bail. My vindication was overwhelming. I half expected him to back out, but the law was on my side. How could it not? He had stolen a car. Of course, the story continued. Conrad posted bail and returned to the neighborhood with a bigger resentment. However, he avoided me. His lawyer probably ordered him to stay out of trouble, but there was another subplot. The local homeowners association, which I'd never joined because I didn't have a traditional house, wanted to talk to me about preserving the integrity of the community. Their spokesperson, Anita, invited me to a private meeting. She asked if I could find a more discreet location for my motorhome until the house is built, saying my situation with Conrad was causing friction. I nearly laughed in her face, but I was polite. I told her that my motorhome was on my private property. I had every legal right to keep it there, and a neighbor's crimes would not affect my life. Anita smiled politely but was clearly upset about hearing no. She even implied that I risked alienating the community by causing discord. I reminded her that I wasn't the one who caused any of this discord. Conrad had a flawed aesthetic sense. She quickly excused herself and never mentioned it again. While all this was happening, friends and family asked me why I didn't leave that neighborhood if the people were so bad. However, I had invested heavily in this land. The lakefront location was peaceful, close to my business clients, and saved me hours of driving. And to be frank, a few petty neighbors weren't going to chase me out. I wanted to defend my rights. My land was legally purchased and zoned for residential construction. Caitlin supported them morally. She said Conrad was furious at her for betraying the family, but she didn't regret it. She believed he deserved legal consequences. The impact on her housing was her biggest concern. She wanted to move and asked if I knew of any nearby rentals. I showed her a small lakeside cabin an older couple rented for vacations. She moved there weeks later, isolating herself from Conrad. She said she felt safer because his temper was unpredictable. Conrad's attorney tried to argue that he was moving the motorhome out of courtesy because it was blocking community access to the lake. But that argument failed even a cursory examination. There is no public path on my property, and my lake access is private. The police's footage, fingerprints, and statements contradicted Conrad's weak excuses. He also broke my motorhome's door lock, proving he didn't have permission or a key. The prosecutor believed the case was solid. Strange events occurred in the months before court. My new cameras captured a figure lurking near my driveway at midnight. I got a phone alert. Heart racing, I remotely turned on the floodlights and saw a hooded person run away. They weren't identifiable, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were Conrad associates trying to get dirt on me or sabotage something. The police advised me to stay vigilant after I reported the incident. When my bank gave me the go-ahead to start building my house, another subplot emerged. A local zoning official checked my property for code compliance. He specifically asked if I had neighbor disputes that could complicate the build. I had to briefly explain the situation and show him the paperwork showing the stolen motorhome case was in court. The official raised an eyebrow, lamenting how petty differences could escalate. However, since I followed all local rules, he didn't see any reason to deny my permits. When I mentioned the suspicious Lake Preservation Committee contact, he shrugged and said there was no such group. That incident did not affect my permits, and I signed the final paperwork a week later. The first Conrad hearing finally arrived. I arrived at the small courthouse in business attire, anxious but determined to resolve the matter. Caitlin and Officer Mark testified, showing camera footage. Room tension was palpable. Conrad stiffened at the defendant's table, occasionally glaring at me. His attorney tried to downplay everything but failed. The judge accepted the video of Conrad entering and driving away my motorhome and my side door fingerprint lock being forced. The judge also heard Caitlin's statement about Conrad's repeated talk of removing my eyesore. If Conrad refused a plea deal, the judge found enough evidence to proceed to trial. Conrad's lawyer requested a brief break before scheduling the next stage. They returned with a plea. Conrad would plead guilty to a lesser charge if the state reduced jail time. Conrad was going to be punished, but the details would be worked out in the coming weeks. The theft was serious, so jail was likely. My daily routine was disrupted. I found myself triple-checking my motorhome locks and searching my property for trespassers. I refused to give up my land, but the stress was too much. Knowing a final resolution was coming made me feel safer. Watching the foundation laid for my house was an emotional victory. I dreamed of living in a safe, permanent home without worrying about it being an eyesore. That day was months away, but each week brought me closer. I made a surprising neighborhood friend around this time. A few streets over, Bruce approached me while I was grocery shopping at a local market. He introduced himself and apologized for my trouble. In contrast to Conrad's extreme views, many neighbors sympathized with me but were too shy to speak up. Bruce invited me to a casual gathering, saying, "If people see you as a friendly face and not just that motorhome person, they might come around." I was intrigued and accepted. Board games and light conversation made for a relaxing evening. Most community members I met were nice. Conrad was even accused of smearing the neighborhood. That night was refreshing. Despite Conrad and his group's negativity, many people respected property rights and minding their own business. I received more district attorney updates over time. Situation was bleak for Conrad. The evidence against him led to a plea deal. He received a few months in jail and probation. He also had to pay for the damage to my motorhome's lock and the towing fee I had to pay when I had a professional tow it back from that hidden lot to my property. I'd driven it temporarily, but it started having engine trouble, possibly from rough handling when it was taken. After Conrad's sentencing, the neighborhood had mixed reactions. Some of the more reclusive neighbors didn't know until the arrest. Others who liked local drama seemed to enjoy the gossip. Some of Conrad's friends distanced themselves from me. However, many sympathized, saying it was unfortunate how things had escalated. I stated politely but firmly that I was defending my right to live peacefully on my property. Conrad served a short sentence in jail, but it was enough to ruin his reputation. Official records show a vehicle theft conviction. His restitution helped pay for repairing my motorhome's lock. adding security features and installing a small fence around where I parked it. When he was released, my house was being built. Foundation poured, walls up. Strangely satisfying was the thought of Conrad watching all this from his aristocratic perch. The final twist was that Conrad had to attend an anger management or community rehabilitation program during probation. He complained constantly about sitting in group sessions, according to Caitlin. He also pretended I had manipulated the situation and that he had done nothing wrong. But the proof was there. Caitlin moved out of the neighborhood, got a job in a nearby town, and rented a small apartment. She said leaving her uncle's toxic environment was liberating. We kept in touch occasionally, and she seemed happy with her new life. Meanwhile, my own life improved significantly. The construction of my new house was a major milestone. I still remember the day the builder handed me the keys to a place that was truly mine in every sense. The house wasn't huge or mansion-like, but it was the perfect size for me, with a porch overlooking the lake and a small office where I could conduct my remote work. The motorhome was now parked to the side, partially visible from the road but more discreet, mainly because I'd rearranged my landscaping to accommodate some tall shrubs. Still, I chose that aesthetic not out of shame, but because I wanted a neat yard. If Conrad had been around to see it, I suppose he might have approved. But ironically, his antics had only solidified my resolve to keep the motorhome exactly where I wanted it. Over time, the drama faded into a neighborhood cautionary tale. People would sometimes whisper about how that guy tried to steal a motorhome and ended up in jail. It became a story that newcomers would sometimes ask me about in hushed tones. I never glorified it, but I also wasn't shy about telling the truth, that I had every right to park my legally owned vehicle on my own land. And if anyone had a problem with it, stealing it was definitely not the way to handle things. What I learned from this entire ordeal is the importance of standing up for yourself and asserting your rights, even in the face of a neighbor who thinks he owns the entire area. I also learned that security measures like cameras and good locks are invaluable. My policy of leaving keys in the motorhome's ignition was naive, and I've changed that practice for good. Nothing drives home the lesson of safeguarding your property like having it stolen, even if it's just next door. Another important takeaway was how crucial community can be. While Conrad and a few others seemed to object to my presence, there were also supportive people like Caitlin and Bruce. Had I not found those individuals willing to speak up or even just invite me into a friendlier circle, I might have started to feel isolated or pressured to leave, but their warmth and understanding made me realize that one hostile neighbor does not represent everybody. Even in small communities that pride themselves on uniformity, there are usually people who value diversity and independence. The last I heard, Conrad's house was up for sale after he completed his probation. He ended up moving away, probably to avoid the lingering social stigma of what he did. I can't say I'm sorry to see him go. The energy of the neighborhood feels lighter without him prowling around, complaining about other people's property choices. A few new folks have moved in to fill vacant homes, and I'm optimistic that the community will continue to grow in a positive way. These days, I'm happily settled in my new house. The build was finished on schedule, and I've decorated the interior with items that reflect my love of travel. Some souvenirs from all the states I've visited during my consultancy work. I kept the motorhome for those times I want to take a spontaneous road trip or host out-of-town friends who don't want to stay in a hotel. If they prefer, they can sleep in the motorhome right by the lake, falling asleep to the sound of water gently lapping the shore. Yes, it's still visible from the road in certain angles, but no one has complained since. Even if someone does, I'm prepared to defend my right to keep it there. Whenever I reflect on the entire chain of events, I still feel that mix of relief and amazement. A neighbor, someone I might have waved to in passing, literally stole my entire motorhome because he thought it disgraced a neighborhood that wasn't even exclusively under his control. It's wild how entitlement can drive a person to do something so blatantly illegal. And yet, Conrad's downfall was swift once the evidence was laid out. The cameras were the key piece that ensured there was no wiggle room for false denials or bizarre accusations against me. Some might say it's petty to take pride in the fact that the cameras I installed basically sealed his fate, but I consider it a well-deserved consequence. If there's a silver lining, it's that I gained a deeper appreciation for personal boundaries and legal rights. I used to assume that neighborly disputes rarely went beyond mild arguments over property lines or noisy parties. Now I know better. Some folks can harbor intense resentment just because something doesn't match their idea of what belongs. I discovered my own resilience too. I could have easily caved to the pressure, sold the land, and moved elsewhere. But I held my ground, quite literally, and it paid off. Today, I wake up in a comfortable bedroom, in a house that I designed, on a piece of land I love. And if I want, I can step into my motorhome for a quick weekend trip. No neighbor can take that from me now. I occasionally still talk to Caitlin, who's doing well in her new life. She remains somewhat estranged from Conrad, but she mentioned that her grandmother, Conrad's mother, has reached out, trying to mend family ties. Caitlin confided that she's not ready to forgive him yet, especially not after he tried to drag her name through the mud for conspiring against him in court. But she's open to the possibility that maybe, someday, they can reconcile. I told her that's her choice to make and she should trust her instincts. As for me, I have no desire to see Conrad again. If one day he reaches out to apologize sincerely, maybe I'll accept. But for now, I'm quite content with the way things turned out. Life in this neighborhood continues. The lake is as beautiful as ever, especially during the early morning hours when the mist hovers over the water. I look out from my new porch and see my motorhome parked to the side, like a loyal friend that's been through thick and thin with me. Sometimes I think about how it was once stolen under my nose, driven off into the night by a man who thought he could control how others live. It's almost surreal when I replay those images in my mind. But then I remind myself that the law came through, justice was served, and I am still here, living my life on my own terms. That simple truth gives me a profound sense of peace and satisfaction. Friends, thank you. See you soon.